Good morning. I am Moira Pauline Iradel from the University of Santo Tomas, and I will present my research entitled The Japanese War Atrocities in the Province of Leyte, 1942 to 1945. Next slide, please. On May 25, 1942, the armies of Imperial Japan received the capitulation of Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Colonel, American Sector Commander of Leyte. The Japanese landed on the beaches of Capuacan, around 50 kilometers northwest of Tacloban. Only about a third of 1,800 USEFA troops in Leyte surrendered. The rest fled to the hills and provoked their guerrilla resistance there. The Tanagano and Matsunaga detachment forces occupied Leyte and the Moira unit between 1942 to 1943. The 6th Division of the Japanese Army conducted an intensive offensive military operation against the guerrillas, also known as Leyte as the Summer Tabato Suzuki Euro, or the outline of mopping up operation and disciplinary action in Leyte and Summer, also known as the October 1943 Reinnovation. The Japanese military administration imposed and assimilated the propaganda in Greater East Asia co-conspiracy sphere to influence pseudo-nationalism in the province. Leyte is known for the return of General Douglas MacArthur and the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. However, the intricacies before that juncture deserve substantial historical analysis. Hence, this paper intends to shed light on the Japanese atrocities, especially from the accounts of the Leyteños. Next slide, please. Let us now proceed to the statement of the problem. The researcher aimed to fulfill the main problem: the Japanese occupation in Leyte afflicted the local socio-economic well-being during and after the Second World War. Sub-problems: firstly, what were the Japanese military operation and propaganda campaigns upon the Leyteños? Second of all, how did the Leyteños survive the atrocities of the Japanese military administration during the war? And lastly, how did the liberation of Leyte by General Douglas MacArthur and former President Sirius Menya Sr. pivotal to the Declaration of Philippine Independence? Next slide, please. Latest historical studies on World War II focus on the Palo landing, the global hegemony, national government, and the military operations. However, limited scholarly works tackled how the Japanese operation trickled down to latest guerrilla assistance, propaganda campaigns, the garrison of towns, starvation, hyperinflation, and worst of all, the war crimes in between. This study aims to synthesize the historiography of local war history to the totality of Philippine history. As per scope and limitation, the study contextualizes the 1942 outbreak in Leyte until the 1945 Philippine liberation. The theory utilized in the study is the challenge response coined by Arnold Toynbee. The varying factors and events that worsen the socioeconomic welfare under the heinous Japanese military administration, or GMA in short, include such challenges responses as shown on the screen. The Japanese coerced the imperialist ideas in politics, education, livelihood, and the Leyteños were challenged to survive these atrocities. The Leyteños once again fled to the mountains, hid from the Japanese control, and vigorously sustained themselves in a Japanese-controlled economy. Next slide, please. The study incorporated the descriptive, narrative, analytic forms of historical writing techniques synthesized by M.C. Lemon. The researcher depicted latest demographic and the collective war encounters provided substantive on the Japanese propaganda and militancy, and most of all, analyzed the long-term effects of the atrocities on the latest civilians. Oral history. Last March 12, 2023, the researcher interviewed her grandmother, Primitiva Misa Iradel, a native of Bato, Southern Leyte. She was only a toddler during the war, yet she vividly recalls the war experiences. This started out as an oral history project for a third-year class of mine and eventually developed into this research presentation today and ongoing undergraduate thesis. Next slide, please. The study utilized primary sources and secondary sources as presented on the PowerPoint slide. These publications retold unfamiliar war experiences to a broader audience and bridged the gap between pre-Allied landing, case studies on war atrocities, the Leyte campaign, and the Philippine liberation. Next slide, please. In May 1942, the Japanese military administration proceeded with the Philippine Executive Commission, and later, requiring Governor Bernardo Torres to stimulate a new order among the Leyteños. By December 1942, the Japanese-sponsored acting Governor Pastor Salazar took over. The 14th Army in Manila issued the September 1943 said decisive mopping up operation against the guerrilla threat. Ormoc and Tacloban were among the main garrison cities and bases of operations. Smaller garrison towns were established, such as in Malitbog, Baybay, Carigara, Tulag, and Palo. And by the end of 1943, the entirety of Leyte was occupied by the Japanese. Next slide, please. Collaborators from provincial and municipal levels launched Japanese propaganda campaigns on the Leyteños, whereas Captain Abe gave Mayor Catalina Hermosilla the authority to govern Ormoc. In Villaba, Mayor Vicente Villoso tried to convince the mountain guerrillas to surrender, exacted residential taxes, and confiscated food supplies from the locals for the Japanese. In Palumpon, elected Mayor Alfredo Perilla collaborated with the Japanese and supplied necessities, especially in October 1943 invasion. Dulag was also known as Little Tokyo because of its large concentration of the Japanese soldiers, and dead bodies of those suspected collaborators floated downstream in the Gitan River. Next slide, please. The Japanese only allowed one political party in the country, Kalipabi, a propaganda agency and a catalyst of pacification, strengthening the conspiracy sphere, especially in the province. The Kempite, or the Japanese military police, anti-zonification, the systematic extermination of soldiers and civilians since 1942. In Alang-Alang, for instance, the Kempite frequently forced residents to give information about guerrillas about the food, using food as incentive. The spies or informants hired by the Kempite would imprison and torture innocent lives once interrogated and refused to divulge. They're usually dressed in khaki uniform with a revolver, maltreated, tortured, raped, killed, and looted the homes of helpless Filipinos. Next slide, please. Another case, female informer Basila Hero befriended the Japanese soldiers in San Miguel, moved to Dulag, and operated a prostitution house for the Japanese there. She informed the Japanese that Jose Balura was an agent of the guerrillas, and 4 Japanese soldiers arrested him and tortured at the garrison, then transported and killed in Alang-Alang. Basilia saw Patron Arero in February 1944 and reported her to the Japanese soldier Yosor, afterward brought to and killed at Alang-Alang. Another case, Ikashano Arupon brought guerrilla prisoners Matero Quintana to the back of a school and executed him there. Lastly, Sebastian Arizo was interrogated by Arupon on the guerrilla's whereabouts while in detention. Arizo was maltreated and hit with a revolver by Arupon for not responding. Next, on the collaborationist press and propaganda, the Japanese urged the governor to establish collaborationist paper, the Leyte Shimbun. In March 1944, the provincial authorities, urged on by the Japanese, developed a semi-weekly paper entitled Leyte Summer Bulletin. The Japanese also took over Tacloban's theater, the Mercedes, and used it for rallies and public showing of Japanese propaganda. Lastly, English was discouraged in elementary schools, but Tagalog and Nihongo were encouraged. The Japanese soldiers handled high school and college and taught how to write Japanese syllabi or katana. Next slide, please. Another issue in the province was the food procurement, wherein PRIMFA, latest rice storage capacity, needed to be increased for the occupying Japanese, the guerrillas, and the civilians themselves. The Filipino government had difficulty preventing the occupying troops from molesting and harming the civilians. Another issue here is the forced labor recruitment. More than 1,000 citizens labored in airfield construction bureauing. The Japanese military authorities in Tacloban were impatient to mobilize civilians in the food production campaign. On April 22, 1944, a Japanese rehabilitating party for a construction project required all male inhabitants of Carigan Leyte to gather in Davao. Another issue was on the sustenance problems of the civilians. Farmers, primarily landless, evacuated to the mountains, cultivated lands of the absentee landlords, and planted vegetable for guerrilla soldiers to sell in the public market at a higher price. There was a prevalence of profiteering, looting, or abuses by guerrilla groups, local officials, and residents. And lastly, according to my grandmother, her family farmed corn and banana, caught fish and alwam, or that small crop in the locality, also ginamos, cooked and wrapped with banana leaves in order to survive. Also, another local terminology mentioned by her was huesticochillo, wherein Leyteños were always in hideouts from patrolling Japanese who would kill civilians, especially those in proximity. Next slide, please. So let's proceed on more war atrocity cases, and how these people survived. Teresita Jimenez Macedo moved to Palumpon, sustained themselves with empanadas, casavas, and earned money with ginamos, chorizo, and rice. Evelyn Castillo recalled her relatives' great involvement, the executions and torture, and survival from the Japanese bombings of those she knew. Remedios Felias, she mentioned in her biography that Japanese soldiers grabbed and slapped her with the butt of a rifle and raped her. She was a comfort woman, and by the end of the war, she was 17 years old. The Japanese also tortured former Governor Vicente de la Cruz, who became impoverished and sickly. Next slide, please. Mr. Deleno, eldest son, developed a mental illness and only had 200 pesos in cash and spent most of the money paying doctor's fee. Unfortunately, their doctors gave up on his son's mental case. Next. Mr. H, the Japanese arrested him and hanged him at Maasim Plaza, and there were ticket sales for those who wished to see the hanging. Jovito Bautista was 9 years old during the war, and he mentioned that they had to bow and greet Ohio or Konnichiwa, where whenever Japanese soldiers passed by, the Japanese garrison Dulag Elementary School and patrolled the town. Also a native from Dulag, Dr. Josefina Cravauso, a retired Eastern Visayas State University professor, was only 4 years old during the war. Next slide, please. The townspeople used Japanese currency, or the Mickey Mouse money, the emergency or guerrilla notes, and so-called original notes, or the pre-war currency. Only those emergency notes printed in Cebu were accepted in Leyte, but were incomparable with the pre-war treasury and banknotes. The Japanese would seize and destroy reimbursement bills with Quezon's picture and acceptable emergency notes depreciated to 20%. Next slide, please. The 6th Army Intelligence Agents warned Canleon of the Allied invasion. A-Day started on October 20, 1944, with American landing on Leyte. On October 23, General MacArthur broadcasted at the Leyte Provincial Capitol building that Osmeña shall be the president of the restored Commonwealth Government. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was decisive for the Pacific theater of operation. Admiral Heisley announced on October 25 that the Japanese Navy had been beaten, routed, and broken. Next slide, please. The locals worked hard to recover from the war. The distributed war jeeps left from Tacloban carried sold goods. By March 1945, the division superintendent of schools for Leyte reopened. Education suffered from destruction of provincial high school and buildings and accumulation of overage students. Next slide. So in conclusion, this paper shed light on the claustrophobic experiences of Leyteños, depict the minuscule attributes of Leyte's war history, their national perspective on Philippine independence. Tragedy robbed the ordinary lives of Leyteños, and war remains a lingering memory. There's no future in war. Next slide, please. Thank you for listening. Here are my references. Next slide. Thank you po.